This is a short overview of the French and Indian War with particular focus on the consequences for the North American continent. I have prepared a note catcher to go along with this presentation. The link is available in the show notes if you would like to use it. Now, the French and Indian War is the outgrowth of a larger conflict between France and Great Britain. It's called the 7 Years' War in Europe. Beginning in about 1650, Europe undergoes an almost never ending period of war between at least some of the major powers, lasting all the way from 1650 to just about the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. This was one such war that would prove, frankly, disastrous for both countries taking part in it. The French and Indian War, as it were, resulted in a couple of reasons. The reason for the war, from the perspective of the North American colonies, was ongoing border tensions between France and Great Britain. Technically, France occupied most of what we would today now call the Great Lakes and much of the Appalachian Mountains between the mountains themselves and the Mississippi River, while the British occupied the 13 original colonies and part of Nova Scotia. The problem is, while Britain's 13 original colonies were relatively populous, France never spent a lot of resources moving colonists in, so its territory was very sparsely populated. Of course, what happened as a result was that British subjects kept pushing further west over an arbitrary line that nobody knew exactly where it was anyway, but into territories that France claimed as their own. In 1753, prior to the outbreak of hostilities, Great Britain controlled the 13 colonies up the Appalachian Mountains, but beyond lay New France. Now, as I mentioned, the border between the French and British possessions was not well defined, and one disputed territory was the Upper Ohio River Valley. British colonial forces, led by General George Washington, attempted to expel the French in 1754, but they were outnumbered and defeated. This ultimately led to the full outbreak of hostilities. The combatants, just to review them for a moment on the French side, would be, of course, the French New World colonialists, of which there were not many, and their various Native American allies. On the British side were British subjects, mostly naval forces, British colonialists, and the Iroquois Confederacy. The war did not begin well for the British. The British government sent General Edward Braddock to the colonies as commander-in-chief of the British North American forces, but he managed to almost immediately alienate potential Indian allies and all the colonial leaders who subsequently refused to cooperate with him. Thankfully, for the British, on July 13th, 1755, Braddock died after being mortally wounded in an ambush on a failed expedition to capture Fort Duquesne in present-day Pittsburgh. Afterwards, the war in North America settled into a stalemate for the next several years, while in Europe, the French scored an important naval victory and captured the British possession of Minorca in the Mediterranean in 1756. However, after 1757, the war began to turn decisively in Great Britain's favor. British forces defeated the French forces in India, and in 1759, a large-scale invasion of Canada began after multiple contingents of redcoats arrived in the colonies. Now, facing defeat in North America and an increasingly tenuous position in Europe, the French government attempted to engage the British in peace negotiations. Unfortunately, British Minister William Pitt the Elder, the Secretary for Southern Affairs, sought terms that were far too high for France to stomach. Pitt demanded not only the French cessation of Canada, but commercial concessions that the French government found unacceptable. After these negotiations failed, the Spanish king, Charles III, offered to come to the aid of his cousin, the French king, Louis XV. Their representatives signed what was called the Family Compact on August 15th, 1761. The terms of the agreement stated that Spain would declare war on Great Britain if the war didn't end before May 1st, 1762. Originally, the Family Compact was intended to force the British into a peace agreement, but ultimately all it did was reinvigorate the French to continue the war and cause the British government to declare war on Spain early in January of 1762. Despite facing such a formidable alliance, the British naval strength and Spanish ineffectiveness led to British success. British forces seized the French Caribbean islands, Spanish Cuba, and the Philippines. Fighting in Europe ended after a failed Spanish invasion of the British ally Portugal. By 1763, French and Spanish diplomats began to seek peace. In the resulting Treaty of Paris in 1763, Great Britain secured significant territorial gains in North America, including all French territory east of the Mississippi, as well as Spanish Florida. The British did ultimately have to return Cuba to Spain. Unfortunately for the British, the fruits of victory brought the seeds of trouble with Great American's colonies. The war had been enormously expensive, and the British government's attempts to impose taxes on the colonists to help to cover these expenses resulted in increasing colonial resentment of British attempts to expand imperial authority in the colonies. British attempts to limit Western expansion by the colonies also vastly irritated the colonial powers. This is the so-called Proclamation Line of 1763. The Proclamation Line is a British-produced boundary marked in the Appalachian Mountains at the Eastern Continental Divide. Decreed on October 7th, 1763, the Proclamation Line prohibited Anglo-American colonists from settling on lands acquired from the French following the French and Indian War. This led to tension between wealthy elites on the coast and new American colonists desirous of new lands to the west. Ultimately, another tangential impact of the war was the removal of the French as a boogeyman for the American colonists. So long as the French were theoretically breathing down the Americans' necks, they were much less willing to break with their mother country. When the threat of France was removed following the French and Indian War, that concern was no longer present, leading to increased tensions and an increased willingness of the colonists to break from their mother country, which they would do hardly a decade later.